Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 78th episode of In the Trenches, Kroll's weekly cyber threat intelligence briefing. Today is the 25th of November, and my name is George Glass, an Associate Managing Director in the Cyber Threat Intelligence team. Joining me today from the CTI team are Sam Flint, Dave Truman, and Sarah Becker. As always, we'll be covering the most recent trends that our threat intelligence team is witnessing in the trenches. So let's get into the situation report. First story, US Department of Justice has charged 5 members of KTA 243, aka Scattered Spider. The DOJ announced charges this week against 5 individuals for alleged role in the attacks linked to the group. The activities carried out involve sending SMS phishing to victim organizations posing as their employer or a vendor supplying them. The indictment noted that the defendants targeted at least 12 organizations in the US for data theft and stole roughly $11 million in cryptocurrency assets from wallets of at least 29 individuals. Next, Oracle has released an advisory for a vulnerability in Oracle Agile Product Lifecycle Management. Oracle has released an alert to address the vulnerability tracked as CVE 2024-21287, which affects Oracle Agile Product Lifecycle Management. The vulnerability is remotely exploitable without authentication and carries a CVSS score of 7.5. The vendor stated that the vulnerability was identified by a third party, and an additional post by an individual has stated that it has been identified in the wild. Oracle strongly recommends that the customers apply the updates provided by this security alert as soon as possible. Next, Phobos ransomware. The administrator has been extradited. The US DOJ has reported on criminal charges that have been put towards an individual who allegedly administered the sale, distribution, and operation of Phobos ransomware. They noted that the individual victimized more than 1,000 public and private entities in the US and around the world. They extorted ransom payments worth more than $16 million. If convicted, the individual faces a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison for each wire fraud count, 10 years in prison for each computer hacking count, and 5 years in prison for conspiracy to commit computer fraud and abuse. Next, another vulnerability. D-Link is urging customers to replace end-of-life devices. D-Link has released an advisory recommending that D-Link devices that have reached end of life or end of support be retired and replaced. This follows a series of recent vulnerabilities released for D-Link routers that are unlikely to get patches or support, and are therefore likely to be exploited in the wild. If you're using an EOS or EOL D-Link device, seek immediate guidance from the advisory or vendor recommendations. Lastly, some geopolitical news from the last week. Last week, 2 undersea fiber optic cables linking Finland and Germany and Sweden and Lithuania were severed in a suspected act of sabotage. Foreign ministers from Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Poland said in a statement, Moscow's escalating hybrid activities against NATO and EU countries are also unprecedented in their variety and scale, creating significant security risks. This follows previous warnings from NATO that undersea cables are vulnerable to attack and tampering. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, please get in touch with us using cti@kroll.com. So let's get into today's briefing. Today we are covering the following trends our team is concentrating on. And this week we have a lot of vulnerabilities to report on. First up, Sam will be taking us through the weaponization of a FortiClient 0-day. I'll be covering a critical vulnerability in a WordPress plugin. Dave has some news on another Palo Alto vulnerability chain. And finally, Sarah will be updating us on Helldown ransomware. So first up, I'll hand over to Sam. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, George. Security researchers have identified exploitation of a 0-day credential disclosure vulnerability in the latest version 7.4.0 of Fortinet's Windows VPN client that allows credentials to be stolen from the memory of the client's process. The vulnerability stems from FortiClient's failure to properly clear VPN credentials from memory after user authentication. This allows attackers to exploit the flaw and steal sensitive information residing in 2 JSON objects within the application's memory even after the user has logged out. According to security researchers, Chinese state-sponsored threat actor KTA-038, aka APT41 Winty Group, is actively exploiting the vulnerability through a plugin named FortiClient within their modular malware framework DEEPDATA. The FortiClient plugin is included through a library with the file name msenvico.dll. The plugin looks for the username, password, remote gateway, and port from two JSON objects in FortiClient's process memory, where the credentials persist. Stolen credentials are then exfiltrated using another tool called DeepPost, which utilizes HTTPS to send files to a remote server. The vulnerability was reported to Fortinet in July, who have acknowledged the issue, but it currently remains unpatched and no CVE has been assigned to it. This attack is reminiscent of a similar vulnerability identified in 2016, which also involved credential exposure in memory due to hard-coded offsets. However, the 2024 vulnerability is new and distinct and works only on recent releases, including the latest version 7.4.0, indicating that it's likely tied to recent changes in the software. By compromising VPN accounts, KTA-038 can gain initial access to corporate networks where they can spread laterally, gain access to sensitive systems, and generally expand espionage campaigns. The ongoing exploitation of this vulnerability, combined with the continued development of DeepData and KTA-038's other malware families, such as LightSpy, poses a significant risk to organizations using FortiClient for Windows VPN. KTA-038 is assessed to be a well-resourced threat actor with potential ties to Chinese government operators. Their consistent development of sophisticated malware families and associated infrastructure, coupled with their continued operation despite public exposure, raises concerns about their capabilities and intentions. To mitigate the risk posed by this unpatched vulnerability, users are advised to maintain a proactive stance to network monitoring, utilizing up-to-date IOC feeds for detections. Deploy endpoint detection and response and next-generation antivirus on all endpoints within your environment to assist in detecting suspicious behavior. Enable MFA or federate access to services to limit an attacker's ability to log in using stolen or brute force credentials. Ensure all security software, including antivirus, firewalls, and EDR solutions are up to date to protect against known vulnerabilities. That's all from me. Back to you, George.
Thank you very much, Sam. Next up, I am covering a vulnerability in a WordPress plugin. A critical vulnerability tracked as CVE 2024-10924 has been identified in the really simple security plugin for WordPress. The vulnerability has a CVSS score of 9.8 and affects all variants of the really simple security plugin running versions 9 to 9.1.1.1. This vulnerability is caused by a flaw in the authentication logic of the really simple security plugin, caused by improper user check handling and two-factor REST APIs. The flaw enables unauthenticated attackers to log in as any existing user on the site, including administrators, when the two-factor authentication setting is enabled. Proof of concept of the exploit code is available publicly and is believed to be used for active exploitation. Administrators are urged to update and install patches for the plugin. Next up, we have an update on a PAN-OS vulnerability chain from Dave. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you. Palo Alto Networks has released two vulnerabilities advisories that, if exploited, provide an attack chain to obtain unauthenticated remote code execution on PAN-OS devices. The first, CVE 2024-0012, with a CVS score of 9.3, is an authentication bypass. The second vulnerability, CVE 2024-9474, with a CVSS score of 6.9, is a privilege escalation vulnerability. The vulnerabilities are fixed in PAN-OS 11.2.4-H1, 11.1.5-H1, 11.0.6-H1, 10.2.12-H2, and 10.1.14-H6. Vulnerability is present in PAN-OS below those versions. The authentication bypass is present in the web management interface and is trivial to exploit. Exploitation is achieved by setting an HTTP header x_pan_auth check to false, and then targeting a resource with a .js.map extension. The privilege escalation vulnerability is due to poor validation of user input. An attacker can supply an OS command in the user field of the create remote app web session.php, where the page will store the command in the session object. This PHP file can be accessed via a .js.map extension, and as such allows for the authentication bypass. Once the command is stored in the session object, hitting the index.php file will trigger the execution of the command. This vulnerability and other recent vulnerabilities in network edge appliances have targeted management interfaces. As such, alongside applying the appropriate update, it is wise to make sure that where web management interfaces are accessible, they are not accessible from the public internet, i.e. the web management servers should be bound to appropriate local network interfaces and not the public-facing ones. This latter recommendation is appropriate for all network edge devices, as it can help mitigate the risk from 0 days in their administration web apps. Thank you. George?
Thank you very much, Dave. Yeah, really serious set of vulnerabilities there. Thank you very much for covering that. And lastly, we go to Sarah for an update on held down ransomware. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, George. So held down ransomware is now shifting tactics and starting to attack VM and Linux systems. They're known for leveraging the vulnerabilities in the Zyxel appliances. According to researchers, Helldown deploys Windows ransomware derived from the Lockbit 3.0 code. Given the recent development of ransomware targeting ESX, it appears that the group could be evolving its current operations to target virtualized infrastructures via VMware. So Helldown is a fairly new group, and they have posted at least 31 different companies within 3 months on their data leak site. These companies are varying from different sectors such as information technology, telecommunications, manufacturing, and healthcare. The ransomware's Windows version does delete system shadow copies and terminates various processes before encrypting the files, while the Linux variant, though not as sophisticated, targets virtual machines by listing and killing active VMs before encryption. Researchers are also noting that Helldown is sharing similarities with possible other ransomware strains like Dark Race and Donex. This is suggesting that there might possibly be a connection or maybe some type of rebranding for this group. We also note that the group's attack chains often begin with exploiting vulnerabilities in the Zyxel firewalls to gain initial access, followed by persistence, credential harvesting, and lateral movement within the network. So despite all these aggressive tactics, the Linux variant of Helldown does lack obfuscation and anti-debugging mechanisms, and this is indicating that it still might be under development. That's all for me, George.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you also to Sam and Dave for also presenting today. That's all we have time for this week, I'm afraid. If you have any questions or comments, please do reach out to us using cti@kroll.com. That's cti@kroll.com. Have a wonderful day.